Hello, it's John Florescu. I'm in Bucharest, and I welcome today for the second time in 2 years, 3 years, Ambassador, excuse me, Mike McFaul. He's joining us from California. So thanks very much for being here.
Sure, glad to be here back.
By I think the background is well known. You're ambassador in Moscow from 2012 to 2014, BA and masters from Stanford University, and Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. I think that's correct. And
Yep.
I also know that you have a distinction of being a persona non grata, in Russia, which you share with George Kennan. So it's been quite a while since then.
Yes.
Um, I am curious, first of all, the book is called Autocrats, Democrats, China, Russia, and America and the New Global Disorder. It's out officially on October 28th. What was the motivation? What drove you to write this book, and why now?
Well, honestly, thanks for having me. It's great to be back. This book, as we were just discussing, I think probably I'd worked longer on this book than any other book I've written, and I've written many books. Definitely longer than my dissertation, which took me 5 years, way back when. The motivations changed over time. So the original motivation was when there was a debate 10 years ago about how bringing China into the World Trade Organization was going to lead to political change, right? Economic change driving political change. I've studied communist countries for most of my academic career. This is my 30th year teaching at Stanford, by the way. I just started in 1995. And back in 1995, I used to even teach about Romania. That was a long time ago, but I was talking about post-communist transitions, right? Because those were in the heady days of transitions. And when I looked at this debate about China, I was like, the communist countries don't change in an evolutionary way. They usually change in a very disruptive way, as of course we learned in 1989 in Eastern Europe, in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I originally was motivated by that to document why that's unlikely. Then the next phase, we had a big debate in America about the new Cold War. Are we in a new Cold War with Russia and China? And I wanted to interrogate that hypothesis. And my answer, like maybe a typical academic, that's why the book's 500 pages long, by the way. But don't worry, readers, it's 3 books in one. You can skip around. But I wanted to interrogate that hypothesis. And basically, my answer is, are we in a new Cold War? Yes. Are we in a new Cold War? No. Both those answers are true. And getting it right, I think, is really important for policy prescriptions moving forward. Then, third, I started writing this book before Putin invaded or escalated his full scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And I kept thinking that we in the United States were over focused on China. You know, I was part of the Obama administration when we did our pivot to China, and then it became the pacing threat under the Biden administration, and the Trump folks shifted. And all of that is important. I want to underscore that is important. Addressing the China challenge will be a central part of foreign policy, should be a central objective of American foreign policy for this entire century. But when we did that, I felt like we were underestimating the Putin-Russia threat. That's because we were just focused on capabilities. You know, how many soldiers do they have? What's their GDP? And not on intentions. And what we've tragically learned is that Putin, of course, doesn't have the capabilities, military or economic capabilities of China or the United States. But what he has is demonstrated that he's going to use in a very consequential, adverse way. And I think we underestimated that threat while focusing on China. And then the final piece of the book, the prescriptive part, in an age when Americans are turning towards isolationist tendencies, first and foremost in the Republican Party, but it's also growing in the Democratic Party. The final part of the book is to explain why trying to isolate, trying to put our heads in the sand, or if we act abroad, doing it in a unilateral way versus multilateral way, is going to lead to bad security and economic outcomes for the United States. that was the chapters I wrote before our last election. But in many ways, with the re-election of President Trump, as those isolationist and unilateralist tendencies become even more acute, that part of the book, I think, is even more important.
Well, it's three books in one, as you
Yeah.
say, and which is a great bargain. I don't know what the book costs, but it sounds like a good deal. And
Yes.
obviously, you're trying to influence an audience. I mean, it could be foreign policy establishment, maybe the overseas leadership. Let's say, the three people you'd most like to read this book and take it seriously? Is it the leaders of the three countries we're talking about?
Maybe, maybe not. I hope that I'll just say people in the Trump administration. I'm not so arrogant as to believe that President Trump has enough time to read my book. I don't think he's going to read my book. I'll send him the slide deck, though. I have a great slide deck that I can summarize the book in 35 minutes. Um, I hope that people in his administration might think about these debates, and I get into some very practical prescriptions in the book, by the way. But I'm not optimistic about that either. I think that I have a bigger audience that I want to try to meet. I want my relatives who voted for Donald Trump in Montana to think about why it's in our interest to be engaged in the world.
Yeah,
And I really want to emphasize my arguments are not about partisan politics.
yeah,
They're
yeah.
about American national security interests.
Mhm.
And these debates about liberalism versus realism, unilateralism, multilateralism, isolationism versus internationalism, they don't fall neatly between Democrats and Republicans here
Yeah.
in the United States. So I have a longer term agenda to try
Mhm.
to bring this debate to all, foreign policy elites, and I'll be giving talks in Cambridge and Palo Alto and Washington and New York. But tomorrow I'm going to the University of South Carolina. Actually, not tomorrow, today. I'm going to the University of South Carolina right after we're done here. Last week I was at the University of Texas, Arlington. Two
Oh
weeks
yeah.
earlier, I was at Trinity University in San Antonio. I'll be going to Boise State and Montana State and giving talks in Pennsylvania and Ohio because I want to get the American people involved in this debate, not just foreign policy elites, because I think we made a mistake, and me too. I want to own this myself. We thought we got this. We know what's in
Yeah.
America's national interest.
Mhm.
The think tanks in Washington, we know
Mhm.
what we're doing. And we lost millions of Americans with that attitude and opened the aperture for this isolationism in particular that scares me, but also unilateralism. Big theme of my book is taking lessons from the Cold War that can be applied to this new great power competition with China and Russia. And at the top of the list is allies. I'm talking to you in Romania.
Yeah.
Like allies is our great superpower as the United States, and people have forgotten that. Promoting democracy and consolidating democracy makes us stronger, makes us safer, makes us more prosperous. When countries flip from dictatorship to democracy, like Romania, that's good for the United States. It creates
Yeah.
better allies and stronger, enduring partners. And I think we have to convince the American people of those arguments, not just think tankers in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And when you're listing those colleges, those aren't particularly elite East Coast colleges. They're
Right.
across the board. I would have to ask you, do you think Americans understand the complexity of Russo-American relations or Sino-Soviet relations? Or as I'm reminded, Richard Haas told me that only 1% of the Americans understand Article 5. They don't understand what it's all about. And God, how do we get into this? When you think about the MAGA crowd, the Democrats across the United States, average Americans, do you think they understand, they have the knowledge to understand a lot what you're talking about?
Well, I don't know that survey data that Richard might have been referring to. He wrote a book, a big book on the world a few years ago, so he would know better than I. Then they might be the diagnostics, but the prescription to that
Yeah.
is to go to
Okay.
Arlington, is to go to Erie, Pennsylvania. I've never been to
Okay.
Erie, Pennsylvania. Instead to go to the American people and make the case. And what I found already in just the first couple of weeks, and I found this with my last book, I go to places I've never been, and
Yeah.
hundreds of people show up. UT Arlington, 500 people were there. Trinity
Fantastic.
University in San Antonio, completely sold out. University of South Carolina just got a note. They have over 500 people registered. I
Fantastic.
was in Fresno, California, here in where I live. Fresno's a pretty red place. It's a big agricultural
Yeah.
place. 1,100 people came to a Tuesday at noon talk. Um, uh,
Wow.
Tulsa, Oklahoma. Last time I was talking about my book, 1,300 people came.
So
So
all blue states.
well, blue and red, but some red. I
Right.
went
Yeah.
to J.D. Vance's hometown, by the way,
Oh,
Middleton, Ohio, because I wanted to see. I've read that book. We shared an agent for
yeah.
my last book, and it was sold out. So I understand that when I go to Arlington, Texas, there's a selection bias who's going to show up to listen to me. I
Yeah.
got that. I know that. But I am constantly amazed at how many people want to talk about these issues. And I think we've made a mistake in assuming that they just care about, other things. Of course, they care about other things, but I
Yeah.
see a big demand for talking about foreign policy in America.
Now, flipping it around in Russia, where you spent a lot of time, even your field work for at Stanford, you were in the 1990s and so forth, and many things changed, you said, in the course of time, and you made that comment last time I spoke to you. But do you think the Russians see this conflict the way Putin sees it, or do you think they're afraid to say how they see it? Where do we stand on that?
John, that's a great question, and I don't have a great answer. And please, to all viewers and listeners, don't believe anybody that gives you a definitive answer to that question
Yeah,
because we don't know. I was in government for a little while, but I spent most of my life in academia. And you're right, in the 1990s, when I was working mostly on Russian domestic politics,
yeah,
I did public opinion work with Tim Colton from Harvard. We published several articles in a book about public attitudes inside Russia. And so I used to know the way the Russians collectively thought about a lot of political issues and electoral issues. But a lot has changed since then. And mostly what's changed, of course, is that Putin has made the Russian regime much more autocratic. I actually think Putin's regime today is more autocratic than the late Soviet regime under Mikhail Gorbachev or even maybe Brezhnev. I lived in the Soviet Union too. I'm that old. And I've compared the level of repression, partly because of technology and partly because of ruthlessness,
yeah,
is greater today than the late Soviet period, and most certainly the period when I was doing survey work, public opinion survey work in Russia. And so, if you're sitting out there in Novosibirsk and Ivan Ivanovich calls you from Moscow and says, "Hey, John, what do you think of Vladimir Putin?"
yeah,
Uh, there's only one rational answer. You praise
yeah,
him
exactly. Yeah,
because you could go to jail for not. Having said that, there are some tricks that some very sophisticated pollsters use to try to get at it, and I would describe it in gross terms in the following way. There's a core, hardcore base that loves Putin. Let's say it's 30 to 40%.
yeah,
And they support him no matter what. After living 25 years in his propaganda bubble, they support the war, they support Putin, they think we're the enemy. And we know kind of who those people are. The older you are, the more rural place you live, the less education you have, and the less money you have, you're more likely to be in that group. Then
yeah.
at the other extreme, there's the hardcore anti-Putin Russians.
Mhm.
Smaller, 20, 25%, but not 5%.
Yeah,
Uh, and they hate this war. They don't like this war. It's disrupted their businesses, disrupted the education of their kids, harder to send them to places like Yale and Stanford, and they care about these things. I used to know these people well when I was
yeah,
ambassador, and we know demographically who they are. The younger, more urban, more educated, richer you are, the less likely you are to support Putin.
yeah,
And then in the middle is what the Russians called the bolota, the swamp, which is just people that don't want to focus on politics. They support Putin, but if the war ended and there was an alternative choice, they would flip. That is, their preferences are very thin. Um, But that's all to say, I don't see the conditions for some kind of pushback from society in this, authoritarian regime inside Russia.
Yeah.
I
Yes.
just don't think it's going to happen. I hope I'm wrong, but
Mhm.
that would be my assessment.
Last month, I spoke to General. So many mysteries about the war. How many are actually dying? That seems to be a mystery. And
Yes.
General Breedlove made an interesting comment that he
Oh,
thought
you
that
had him on.
he was a couple
Oh,
months ago. He
oh,
was
he's
terrific.
fantastic.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
he
I'm a
tell it
huge
like it
fan.
is. Very plain spoken. I love
Yeah,
him.
yeah. I'm
He
a
said
huge
there's been
fan.
a huge exaggeration of the land acquisition by Russian soldiers. That we always get the feeling that the Ukrainians are on their back, hind legs, and so forth. But he says if you look at the numbers, it's a lot less. Do you have any feeling about that fact or that assertion?
Well, first, I'm not a decorated general like General Breedlove, so I'm going to leave the military analysis to him. He's
Yeah.
really, him and another General Hodges are my two favorite analysts of the war. And I interact with them frequently. But yeah, I talk to Ukrainians pretty much every single day. And people who are on the front line. And I would say a couple things to echo generally or to foot stomp what General Breedlove said. First of all, yes, they grabbed some territory at the beginning of the war,
Yeah.
but if you look at those maps, they've only made extremely incremental territorial gains since
Yeah.
2022 at tremendous cost to their soldiers and their economy. Right? They're just slaughtering young men, mostly men, for very little gains, and that's
Mhm.
because this has become a war of attrition fought mostly by drones. 80% of the casualties now on
That's
both
interesting.
sides are done by drones, not by tanks rolling across land. Because if you move on this battlefield now, you're hit by drones, and so it's stuck. And the drone production on both sides is astronomical. 100. I'm not going to remember the numbers off the top of my head. I'll
Yeah.
put them out on social media, but multiples, by the way, of what the United States of America is producing in terms of
That's
drones.
interesting.
Some of the best drone companies in the world are Ukrainian right now. And
I
by the
see.
way, that's another reason why we want Ukraine on our side, on the side of NATO, on the side of the United States, because they are going to be a net supplier of security when this
Mhm.
war is over. Um, but the third piece, I think it's important to push back on this narrative that the Russians are winning, because that is a common perception here in the United States. President Trump, he's all over the place, but sometimes that's what he says.
Yeah.
And it's just not true. It's just not true. They have not even conquered the four territories, the four regions of Ukraine that Putin already 3 years ago annexed on paper in a great ceremony in Moscow. So it's not to say that the Ukrainians are pushing them out, but are the
Yeah.
Russians winning this war? Absolutely not.
And in terms of the provocations that the Russians are engaged in, the thing at King's College Hospital in London, at the
Yes.
airports in Munich and Copenhagen, and just yesterday in Romania, some bombs the bomb package that was sent. Um,
I didn't
I,
know
I,
that.
I was surprised by Sikorsky's speech at the UN. I thought that was very powerful when he sort of gave a warning or gave explicit warning to the Russians. Do you think there's a big danger that one of these provocations, given that some people are a little more trigger happy than others, could lead to, what we saw in World War One or World War Two?
Well, I certainly hope not. But I'm also worried about it. Putin is testing the alliance. There's no doubt about it.
Mhm.
He wants to see if we're united, and one of his central objectives is to divide the NATO alliance. He's been
Mhm.
working on that for a long time. And
Yeah.
one of his strategies for doing it, by the way, is to support, illiberal nationalist autocrats within countries in Europe. It's not just a fight. My book's called Autocrats versus Democrats, and I go through comparisons with the Cold War. One of
Yeah.
the things that I think is different is that the fight today is not just between countries, right? We all remember, the blue states, blue team and red
Yeah.
team, right? And it was very clear, and the border in Europe was very clear. And that's still part of the drama today. but the drama is also within states because, Mr. Putin has his ideological allies, as you know well, including in Romania,
Yeah.
but he has them all over Europe and he has them here in the United States, and he wants to break up the NATO alliance. He wants to go back to some kind of 19th century sphere of influence world, and that just, in my view, is not in America's national interest. And then second, he's provoking and prodding and probing the alliance to see if there could be fissures. Sikorsky is one voice, a very strong voice, but there might be others in the alliance that don't want to be, in my view, as strong as Sikorsky. I'm a big admirer of Foreign Minister Sikorsky's approach. Um, uh, I just think we should remember two things. One, Putin, people always say, well, he's going to do this and then we're going to get into World War I. I think Putin is not as confident in wanting to get into World War I
Yeah,
with
I agree with that. Yeah.
powerful NATO alliance in the world, anchored by the most powerful military in the world. His army is stuck fighting Ukraine. Uh,
Yeah.
think about that for a moment, right? He can't move on the ground against the Ukrainian army. Does he really want to take on the entire NATO alliance? I just think he's not that irrational.
Mhm.
But two, I would also say when confronted, Putin has backed down before. And
Yeah.
people forget this. In fact, this is not the first time the jets have thrown through, Russian jets have
Yeah.
flown through NATO territory. In 2015, when Putin decided to deploy his air force to prop up Assad in Syria, those
Mhm.
airplanes started flying through Turkey. And
Mhm.
Erdogan said, he gave him a couple warnings and he said, stop this. This is our territory. You're violating our airspace.
Mhm.
And Putin kept flying those airplanes through. Well, you know what
Mhm.
Erdogan did? He shot one of them down.
Oh,
Uh,
that's interesting. I wasn't aware of
and
that.
you know what happened afterwards?
You
Russian
stopped.
airplanes stopped flying through Turkey.
That's
That was a
interesting.
NATO ally, by the way. People forget that. So I think, a lesson from that is if we push back on Putin, maybe these provocations might stop.
Because in
John,
Europe, of course, it depends on how close you are. If you're in Portugal, you're not too worried about,
Right.
Russia. If you're in Lithuania, it's another ball game.
Yeah.
And I find him rather seems sort of fearless in his comments, unlike European allies that always in the back of their mind have to believe that the only way he could prevail would be with short strategic nuclear weapons. Jim, you had to want to jump in there.
yeah, I wanted to. And the discussion of Putin is very interesting in this regard because one of your points in the book is there are three major elements: power, regime, and personalities.
Yeah.
And power, the way I read your argument is um, the U.S. has a lot of power, China has a lot of power, uh, Russia has more attitude.
Yes. Yeah, that's good. I like that phrase. Jim.
um,
Our attitude.
but they're individuals in each case. And so, talk
Right.
a little bit about. I mean, Donald Trump is not going to be president forever.
Right.
Putin is not going to be running Russia forever. Xi is not going to be running China forever. Talk a little bit about how you see the personalities in terms of the risks and opportunities.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jim. And I do. Thanks for adding that. That's the explanation. Those are the explanatory chapters right in the beginning, the historical chapters, how we got here. And in my world in academia, just so you guys know, you won't be surprised by this. If you've been in politics or you've been in diplomacy, that the statement that individuals matter seems kind of dumb and obvious. But in academia and social sciences and political science, we write individuals out a lot. And in a lot of history these days, we write individuals out. We talk about structural forces like power, and that's all that matters, right? And I just disagree. I think power, my book starts with power, right? Everything starts with power, but then you got to add regime type, because I think autocratic regimes behave differently than democratic regimes. And I don't think it's an accident of history that democracies tend to ally with each other and not go to war with each other. But then,
Mhm.
even on top of it, there are individuals. And I think Xi Jinping has pushed China to be much more aggressive than previous Chinese Communist Party leaders. And I think that has to do with his individual worldview and his personality. Putin, there's no doubt about it in my mind. And then Trump, it's complicated because the pivot to more great power competition uh, started actually in the Obama administration. We actually use that word, the pivot. But I do think the Trump administration, I think they were right about this, by the way, in their national security strategy, wrote about great power competition, and they called it the revisionist powers of China and Russia as being a major threat to American national interests. That was, General McMaster was the national security advisor at the time. I think they were right about that. What I don't know is if President Trump agreed with that. I don't think he did, by the way, because, for 4 years, that was his national security strategy. But the way he dealt with Putin was the entirely opposite. And now this second time around, I think it's kind of confusing what he himself believes. But back to Xi and Putin, I do think that a different leader, they're not. I'm going to make a giant, big social science prediction.
Go ahead.
Well, you already made it. You already made it, Jim. Putin will not rule Russia forever, and Xi Jinping will not rule China forever. And I'll start with the case I know better, and then I'll pivot to Xi Jinping. After Putin, there will initially be some Putin light character that's, I don't know who it is, but some kind of continuity with Putinism and the regime. But that leader is not going to have the same grip on power that Putin has today. I just don't see anybody emerging that has that. And I think it'll create a moment of opportunity to rethink this trajectory they've been on. Uh, that's what happened after Stalin, by the way. That's what happened after Brezhnev. And it wasn't right away. It took 3 or 4 years before you got to Khrushchev and Gorbachev.
Yeah.
But I think that there's going to be a debate at least. And it's an open question who wins the debate. But the notion that they're going to become more aggressive and fascistic, I know a lot of people make that argument. I don't see that. I know that there are a lot of elites in Russia that think that Putin overreached. Same with Xi Jinping. I go to China. Maybe after this book is published, I won't be able to go anymore. But I talk with, again, more economic elites and academics. I don't want to claim that I have access to the Politburo, but there's a sense of overreach there too. The government is reaching too much into the economy. That's creating a lot of trouble. All this provocative stuff with Hong Kong, the South China Sea, India, Taiwan. Many people are asking, we can't afford to do this. We've got some big structural problems here at home. So I think there's going to be a big debate there as well. And here in the United States, I most certainly hope there will be change in foreign policy because I think a lot of things that President Trump is doing right now is not advancing America's national interests. And I talk about those in the book. And that's partly why I wrote the book, is to provide an alternative. And to put it crudely, Trump is an isolationist. I'm an internationalist. I think we're better off engaging versus not. When he uses action, Trump is a unilateralist. I'm a multilateralist. I think we're better off with allies, and I think we're better off using multilateral organizations to advance our security and economic interests. And I hate these terms. They're from academia because they're not exactly right. But in my world, they're called realists versus liberals. Realists believe that only power matters and regime type doesn't matter. Liberals, and that's the classic liberal definition, going back to Britain in the 18th century, they think that regime type matters and that therefore we should promote democracy. Trump doesn't believe that at all. He doesn't think in terms of autocrats and democrats. I do. I think the advance of liberty and freedom in the world has not only been the moral thing to do, and I think Americans are a moral nation and a moral people. I get the biggest applause lines I get in my book is when I'm talking about issues of good and evil and right and wrong. Very different than when I talk to academics and foreign policy elites about these things when they say these things don't matter. But I think they do matter, and I think they have mattered for American security. And I hope that in the next presidential election that we have this debate. And I hope that we do some course correction after the Trump administration, or hopefully even before, of course, like we already talked about. I'm still trying to do what I can for that, but I hope that the next administration might take on some of the ideas in my book a little more seriously.
Well, your book had fantastic reviews. I haven't been able to read the book, but I've read the reviews that have been first rate. So that's terrific. We were talking about character a moment ago. Does it seem to you, in a way, that Trump and Putin are almost polar opposites? Trump is an ideologue, it seems. He wants to reclaim Catherine the Great, all these lands. And Trump, of course, is a deal maker. So you wouldn't think that those two people together could really work something out. What's your view on that, and also on the stalls coming together in Budapest?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm glad you called Putin an ideologue because that oftentimes people don't describe him that way. I do think Putin has changed over the years and decades. I first met him in 1991, so we go way back. We're not exactly Facebook friends. Not only has he banned me from Russia in 2014, but he also has indicted me. He wants to arrest me. So, and I think he's done just tremendous, horrific things. First and foremost in Ukraine, of course, but also inside his own country, and has killed two of my friends. Because they had the audacity to think that Russians should elect their own leaders. Um, he has become more ideological over time in two respects. One, he's got this anti-European, anti-liberalism, the decadent West, and that
Yeah,
we, Russia, we have these more traditional conservative values that have nothing to do with Europe. And I've listened to him say that. I've been in the room with him when he talks about that. It's very deep. It's not just instrumental. I was even in a meeting with him with the Vice President Biden in 2011. When he turned to the Vice President Biden, he didn't turn to him. He stared at him. He stares. He
yeah,
can look at you without blinking for a long time. And he said, Mr. Vice President, one of your troubles is you look at us and you look at the color of our skin. He went kind of like this. And because we look like you think that we
huh,
think like you.
that's interesting.
But we don't. And he kind of leaned in and he said, because we're not part of your world. We're not part of Europe. We're not part of the liberal international order. And that's his mindset.
Yeah,
I, and therefore that's his way of thinking. And when you're when you're motivated by deep ideology, especially later in your life, when you're thinking about your
yeah,
legacy, it's hard. You're not transactional, right? He doesn't care about how many Russians will die. Trump is more a complicated leader for me to understand because on the one hand, he also is kind of an illiberal nationalist, right? Anti-immigrants, anti-trade, and at least he talks the talk. And
yeah,
certainly his MAGA movement has a lot in common with Putinism.
hmm,
So much so that if you listen to a podcast, like say InfoWars, with millions and millions of followers, they'll have on Russian ideologues like this guy
hmm.
Alexander Dugin.
Dugan, yeah, it's
He's
finished.
very popular in the MAGA world. And
Yeah,
Dugin is one of the chief ideologues of Putinism and the Putin world. So they have that affinity, right? And this kind of ethnic white versus not, they have that affinity ideologically. But what I'm not sure of, which is a good, to underscore something you said, John, I'm not sure how deep Trump really believes all that stuff. I
yeah,
think it's more instrumental. And I do think he has this do a deal mentality, and sometimes it's worked out for him.
yeah,
I give him credit for ending the war in Gaza and getting those hostages free. That deal mentality proved
yeah,
to be effective there. I think it just clashes in dealing with Putin, and it hasn't worked. And you see some of that frustration with the president that Putin's not eager to do a deal. He thinks that time's on his side, and therefore, it didn't was kind of a disaster in Alaska. Now, the more we learn about Alaska, I think the worse that meeting was, which makes me rather pessimistic about some kind of breakthrough in Budapest.
Do you think this constantly kicking the ball down the field that seems to happen, and buying more time? Do you think this is fundamentally an attempt by Putin to gain time, but not to really engage in a solution? And at a certain point, I would imagine that the president, Trump, would lose either patience, and he could go one of two ways. He could either squeeze Zelensky a little harder, or he can capitulate the other way. How do you think that could happen, play out?
Well, that's a great way to frame it. And I do think Putin is buying time. And I would just note that despite all the tough rhetoric from time to time from Trump and other members of his
Yeah,
team, the Trump administration has not implemented one new sanction since they took over.
that's
Not a
interesting.
single new sanction.
Amazing.
And there's this legislation pending, and every time Putin and Trump say they're going to get together, the leaders pushing that legislation kick it down. They're not going to bring it up until after Budapest. That was just literally announced yesterday, right? So in that regard, Putin is achieving his objective. You know, there was a lot of hope, I know, from the Ukrainian team in Washington last week that they were going to get these Tomahawk long-range missiles.
Yeah,
And Putin inserted himself into that meeting, asked for a phone call, and convinced Trump to delay that decision. So
yeah,
time is working on his side. Um, uh, I hope that President Trump we've seen hints of it, will get frustrated by being played by Putin. I
yeah,
mean, let's be clear. In my conversations with Americans and people around the world, they look at this and they look at Trump looks very weak. He looks feckless, and I think he's starting to understand that. That's a good thing. But what he then needs to do is to create more leverage for himself. And I think that's more sanctions and more weapons to Ukraine. I mean, and think about it. Yes, I'm glad we are selling weapons to our NATO allies that then give them to Ukraine. That's a good thing. But I'm also a little embarrassed as an American that Americans and American companies are now making money off the war in Ukraine.
yeah,
That doesn't sit well with me.
yeah,
And, I applaud President Trump for talking about burden sharing, and all the countries of NATO need to do their fair share and get to 5% or 3.5%, depending on how you count the numbers. I support that 100%. But why aren't we sharing the burden, therefore, when it comes to Ukraine? We should be doing our fair share as well. And I just think if he adopted that, he would get Putin's attention, and that might help create the permissive conditions for at least a ceasefire.
You mentioned there, Mike, the Alexander Dugin, and I don't think he will be a big fan of your book because you have a chapter called Competition and Confrontation, or at least you are not necessarily inevitable. And Dugin says there's these historical shifts through the unpredictable unfolding of war. He believes that.
Yes,
And
he does.
so, and I think, how much of influence does this Dugin have, do you think? He's like a Steve Bannon or something on the boss, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a hard question to know. I used to know Sasha Dugin, by the way, decades ago. He also has become more radical in his views.
Yeah,
Um, what's cause and what's effect is hard to know. It's kind of like Bannon and Trump. I think that's a great
yeah,
analogy, right? We don't know how much Bannon is influencing Trump versus just
yeah,
helping Trump and echoing what he says. But there's no doubt in my mind, and there are other people, other very prominent kind of ideologues, people I
yeah.
used to know, that there is this intellectual movement
Mhm.
inside Russia about conservative values, sovereignty, empire. They're imperialists. They're just straight up imperialists. They're not ashamed. To call Putin a czar does not offend him. And this notion you alluded to it earlier that Putin wants to be on the list with Catherine the Great and Peter the Great
Yeah,
about Russian leaders who expanded the Russian Empire, not the Soviet Union. He doesn't want to, he's not a communist, but he is an imperialist. And Dugin thinks in these terms. And, it creates this echo chamber, and you see it on Russia Today, you see it on their
yeah.
national television stations,
Telegram.
and they're all controlled, by the way, by the Kremlin now. And it's become more radical, I would say, over time. These imperial attitudes and this anti-European, anti-Western attitude, where they see it, as like a clash of civilizations, right?
Yeah.
They love Huntington, by the way, and they
Yeah.
love John Mearsheimer at the
Yeah.
University of
Chicago.
Chicago. They're two of their favorites in terms of American academics. But Dugin, I would say his ideological orientation is the prominent orientation of the Putin regime today. Whether he's reflecting it or causing it, I'm not sure.
Right. You mentioned the thing about the United States not doing more in Ukraine and picking up the burden sharing. I was in Moldavia and actually in Transnistria about 10 days ago.
You were? Oh my
Yeah,
goodness.
I slipped over the border and actually I saw Russian troops there on the Russian tanks under camouflage. But I had the feeling that there's an enormous propaganda campaign going on, probably intensified just because of they haven't made much headway in Moldavia. Do you think the West is doing enough, both in terms of pushing back on disinformation and so the cyber attacks? Do you think the West is manning up to the job?
No, I don't. Um, and in my book, I have 3 chapters about what we should do in the future, right? So usually you're allowed one, and I convinced my editor to give me 3. He wasn't happy about that, but I prevailed because they're under 3 different titles. So one is mistakes in the Cold War to not repeat again. So if we're in a new era of great power competition, one
Yeah.
of the arguments I make in the book, well, let's learn from the last one. And I really wanted a chapter on mistakes because now that we won the Cold War, but I actually think Romanians and Ukrainians and Estonians and Poles and even Russians rising up against dictatorship, they were the ones that really, won that competition. We helped. But when you win, you forget about your mistakes, right? So I used to
Yeah.
coach 3rd grade basketball. When we won, we forgot when our star player had 3 fouls in the second quarter and had to sit out, right? We do that all the time. But we made some big mistakes, and I won't go through them now. But
Yeah.
McCarthyism, the war in Vietnam, propping up dictators that we didn't need to prop up. But the second prescriptive chapter is about successes in the Cold War that we should be replicating again today. And on that list, that's where I have, the creation of the U.S. Agency for International Development, Radio Free Europe,
Yeah.
National Endowment for Democracy, trade organizations that brought the free world together. People forget it wasn't the international order during the Cold War; it was the free world, and we united the free world and kept the communists out. And then we became richer, and that helped us win the Cold War, right? West
Right.
Germany became richer
Right.
than East Germany, United States richer than the Soviet Union. That was a fantastic strategy during the Cold War. And what I see today, Trump is just abandoning those instruments. I mean, he shut down USAID completely. Again, I want to underscore. Did the USAID have some really stupid grantees around the world? Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've written
Yeah.
about reforming USAID for 20 years. But reform is one thing, destruction is another thing. And I would just remind your viewers, the Chinese are not shutting down their economic
Yeah.
assistance program because we are. Their Belt and Road Initiative is going big and strong. Same with international broadcast. If we shut down VOA and Radio Free Europe and
Yeah.
Radio
Which
Free
all shut
Asia,
down. Yeah.
they're not doing that. They're expanding it, including in Europe, by the way.
Yeah.
And both Russia and China are doing that, by the way. The Russians are much more sophisticated than I think we've understood in this propaganda war stuff. And they even have like their own NGOs that meet with
Yeah.
like-minded NGOs. They use the Russian Orthodox Church to
Yeah.
tremendous effect to
Yeah. That's
find
right.
like-minded thinkers in Europe and the United States. And so if we're going to, compete in this era of great power competition, we need these instruments of soft power. And I just think those have been cataclysmic mistakes that the Trump administration has been making.
Well, I've seen what you're talking about in Moldavia. They had a brigade of Orthodox priests that kind of make jokes about, let's say, gay lifestyles in the West, things
There you
like
go.
that. That's kind of thing.
That's exactly
I
it.
don't know if you recall, after Trump was elected, he was down in Mar-a-Lago, and somebody asked him, have you called anybody? He says, why do I call him? I had 120 phone calls from countries that I didn't know existed. Leave aside the offense there, but anyways, a funny Trump comment. But then he said, but gee, I spoke to him, and I said, we have a big economy, you've got a huge economy, we've had a big military, you've got a big military, and we can talk, we can sort out things together. To the extent that you said, and Bolton says, and others, that no one really knows his mind, do you think it's possible that they envisage, the administration, somehow a grand alliance between the United States and China, where, as Trump put it, we could sort out a lot of the world's problems together?
Well, President Trump most certainly talks in those terms, especially about China and Russia, right? And I would say even more about China these days.
Yeah,
If I divide the world between autocrats and Democrats, I think Trump divides the world between strong leaders and weak leaders in his mind,
yeah,
irrespective of whether they're autocrats or Democrats. He doesn't care about that. It's very clear to me, right? Loves Viktor Orban, for instance, right? My good
yeah,
friend Viktor, where is he? Where is he? Every time he in Sharm el Sheikh, that's the way he thinks. Um, Now, I think he's wrong about that. I think that's not in the long-term national interest of the United States. And I have a different set of prescriptions that follow from the way I see the world. But I want to underscore that in my successes chapter, I talk about even at the height of the Cold War, we did find a set of common interests with the Soviets that were
mhm,
good for America, good for the Soviet Union, and I would say good for the world.
yeah,
So, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that was signed in 1968. That's at the height of the Cold War, right? We're in
yeah,
Vietnam, we're fighting the communists, they're taking over the world. We're
yeah,
doing all kinds of things in competition there. But we found it that we both had an interest in not seeing the proliferation of nuclear weapons around the world. Eradication of smallpox, that happened during the Cold War. That was through superpower cooperation. And I think that's a good model and metaphor from the Cold War that we could adopt with the Chinese. We're going to compete with the Chinese, and no amount of happy talk is gonna calm Xi Jinping down by the fact that ideas about democracy and liberty and freedom threaten his regime. That's the way it is for autocrats. Same with Putin. No, saying that we're not going to help these ideas. Well, guess what? There's small D Democrats in Hong
yeah.
Kong and Taiwan. They're going to do it with or without us, right? So that's going to be there. That's going to be a tension in my view for many decades to come. But we should be able to compete in those dimensions and cooperate, say on AI, like artificial intelligence. Neither China or the United States has an interest in AI models that will help terrorists build nuclear weapons
Yeah.
or create lethal viruses that can kill millions of people. And we're there right now. It is a scary world. We have people that work on these issues here at Stanford who are expert.
Yeah,
It is scary. And
yeah.
so that to me is an issue where, there are many others, but we should learn to compete and cooperate at the same time, like we did with the Soviets during the Cold War.
Going back to college days, everybody remembers Sino-Soviet courses in political science,
Yes.
and that really taught you they could probably never get along. And and Chinese were isolationists going back not decades, but maybe a century and so forth. Do you think this romance could unravel in the same way in the same way Trump's affection for Europe somewhat dim? Do you think Kissinger said that Russia belongs to Europe going back 300 years? Could this thing unravel? Is there enough in history, in your view, that romance could come apart?
Well, the first thing I'll say, one of the differences, because you alluded to it, between great power competition today and most of the Cold War is that for most of the Cold War, the Soviets and Chinese were split,
Yeah,
and Henry Kissinger played a role in that, and now they're united. And Putin and Xi Jinping are close, and I don't see a scenario going back to what I was talking about with Jim that those individual leaders are going to split.
mhm,
And the notion that we're going to pull Putin to our side is just crazy. That's not going to happen. He doesn't, we're the enemy for him. Number one. Number two, he wouldn't trust us because we elect a new leader every, 4 years.
Yeah, right.
And number three, he's got this very loyal autocrat buying all his energy. We're not going to buy his energy.
Right.
That just makes no sense. And so there's this, reverse Kissinger that some people in Washington talk about, pull the Russians away to contain China. That's not going to happen while Putin is in charge, and it won't happen with Xi Jinping in charge in China.
But
Having said
John,
that, you
go ahead.
asked a longer term view over
Yeah.
hundreds of years, and over hundreds of years and decades, of course, Putin doesn't believe that Russia is a European country, but I do. And you know
Yeah.
what? There are a lot of Russians that agree. And so, with a different political leader and a different regime, most certainly, I think that could happen in the future, but not while Putin's in power.
Right. Jim.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to our allies because you make a big point of part of our superpower is our alliances. To me, one of the ironies of Putin's attack on Ukraine is his rhetoric is he doesn't want NATO at his borders.
Right.
And now he has NATO as his borders, more of his borders, because of obviously Finland and Sweden.
Right.
And the one country that he said is so culturally similar to Russia, Ukraine, he now has the overwhelming number of Ukrainians angry at Russia for a couple of generations to come.
Yes.
My question is, does he or his allies understand the problem they've caused themselves?
I don't know the answer to that, but your analysis is completely right. Whether Putin understands it, I don't know. But that is, that is the irony, or maybe the evidence to underscore why maybe this is not all about NATO expansion. So, John, you're in Bucharest today, right? So,
Yep.
there was a famous summit there in 2008
Yep.
that I think was extremely consequential. The alliance was divided about expansion to Ukraine and Georgia in tragic ways, in my view. And 3 months later, Putin goes in, the Russians go into Georgia. And after that event, this is all before I was in the government, but when I got into the government and learned our attitudes about NATO expansion to Georgia, both in the United States, but especially in the NATO, the rest of Europe, that intervention ended that debate. And we just put on a slow burner, NATO membership for both Ukraine and Georgia since that war. And then Yanukovych becomes president in Ukraine in 2010, and I met with Yanukovych during that period, and they were there. This notion that we were rushing to expand NATO to Georgia and Ukraine is complete nonsense. Maybe we should have been. My view is we should have been personally, but I was there for 5 years in the government. That is complete invention of history that Putin pushes. I was at the NATO summit in Lisbon in 2010. You know who else was there? Medvedev, President Medvedev, talking about missile defense cooperation. Because, by the way, we were trying to roll out at the time our new missile defense architecture in Romania and Poland, by the way, EPAA, and we were trying to do it the European phased adapted approach. We never get any credit for that, I just parenthetically, but it was a really good idea. And now I think people are understanding that it was a good idea to have these missiles and these radars in Poland and Romania. I know the Poles and Romanians think that it's a good idea. I think most people, everybody else has forgotten, but we were cooperating then. So I actually think, to your point, Jim, that Putin, his actions actually underscore that he's not threatened by NATO expansion. He's threatened by democratic expansion.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And what worries him most in Ukraine, and I want to come back to a story I told you about the Biden-Putin meeting. Now I want to add another anecdote that my good friend Boris Nemtsov used to always say to me before he was assassinated in 2015. Boris, when we were talking about these issues with regard to Russia, would always say, you Americans, you can't do much here in Russia. Putin's got it all locked down. He said, if you want to help democracy, small d Democrats in Russia, do everything you can to consolidate democracy in Ukraine. And this he said before 2014, before 2022. And the reason he said it, he said if they can be a thriving democracy and a thriving capitalist economy, that will undermine Putin's argument that Slavic people are different and that they need a different regime. Because remember, I didn't say it. Putin thinks that Ukrainians are just Russians with accents. That's what he tells his people at home. They're not a real nation. The Bolsheviks divided them in 1917, and then we helped with the collapse of the Soviet Union. They're just like us. But if they're just like you, Mr. Putin, and they're practicing democracy, then maybe we don't need imperialist dictatorship in Russia. And I think it was the revolution of dignity in 2014, a revolution, by the way, that happened because Ukrainians wanted to join Europe. And then followed by the free and fair election of President Zelensky. I think that is the threat first and foremost to Putin. And that's why he did these, in my view, very irrational things. If you're trying to, stop the expansion of NATO and keep the Ukrainians out, that's the only way to explain that.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you for that. I think that I haven't read the book because I can't read the book, but I read reviews of the book and also your Monarch notes, those Monarch notes like in college where you get a kind of a feel for what's coming down. But it's 3 books in one. Christmas is around the corner, so it's a good thing to buy. It's a good value. And I thank you once again for coming. I really appreciate it. And good luck on the college tour and good luck with the book.
Thank you, guys. Great to chat with you. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.